We are here on island side looking at its diesel engine. It's a universal M23 XPB, just like on Mark III and Sorella, although this one is significantly newer, the engine having been replaced probably 8 or so years ago. So it's very similar. There's only some slight differences between the two Catalina 30s, but one nice advantage here is that when you remove the doghouse, you have excellent access to the engine. So we are going to first open the water through hull, check the strainer, and then start talking about the cooling system. To get to the strainer, you have to go behind the engine, open up a panel, and then you see the strainer. Again, this is nice and clear. We see the key on the through hull. I'm going to take that key off, open the through hull, and so from the through hull through the strainer, we now have an interesting feature tucked up right here. This is actually a water flow sensor. Islandside is the only one in our fleet that has a functioning water flow sensor, which will alarm if the water is not flowing. So when you actually turn the key on, you'll have the oil pressure alarm going off. You'll also have a slightly different tone associated with the water flow alarm. So this is nice in case you suck up a plastic bag or some kelp, because as soon as that water stops flowing, the alarm goes off. And it's telling you either you don't have oil pressure or you've sucked up a bag. So nice feature on this boat. It'd be nice to have them on all the boats. We looked at the strainer and the flow gauge. That then comes up here. That's the line coming in, and it goes to the raw water pump, which is nicely on the front of the engine. And if you wanted to change the impeller, all you have to do is take these 4 screws off, take this plate off, take off a retaining ring, pull the impeller out, and put a new one in. This line then goes back over to our heat exchanger, pretty much similar to the other M23s on the Catalinas, and then goes off over here. This line is the raw water coming out of the heat exchanger. It goes over to the get injected into the exhaust just above the aqualift. And on this boat, the aqualift is tucked down in kind of behind the head in front of the aft berth, off to the port side of the engine, and a little more difficult to get to than on the 30s, but it's the exact same aqualift, at least as on Mark III. Now, there is a valve on the back of it which can be accessed from the aft berth. You have to pull up a panel and be able to reach in there, and that's the drain valve. And as you've seen from some of the other videos, the reason to drain that is if you're cranking the engine and the engine doesn't start, you are still pushing water through the heat exchanger into that aqualift, and it will eventually back up into the exhaust manifold and into the engine. through the exhaust valves. So that's critically important on all of these boats, that if you're cranking more than 30 seconds and it doesn't start, to drain that. And there's a placard by the key in the cockpit saying exactly that. Okay, now let's talk about the freshwater or antifreeze coolant system. We see the reservoir here, and you wouldn't open this valve unless you were changing the coolant. This line comes from the port cockpit lazarette, where there is a reservoir bottle. It then comes through here. This is the high point. You can actually vent at that high point. And there's a thermostat that will open when the engine gets warm. This line then goes off here to the water heater. And so if you ever had a coolant leak in the water heater, you could actually just simply bypass all of that by hooking this line right back up to here. You wouldn't have hot water, but you might have a cooling system. This is the pump then for the freshwater system. It pumps it through the engine. It then comes back to that heat exchanger, gets cooled, and then comes back around to, you can't really see the hoses very well here, but comes back around to this freshwater reservoir. So pretty much the same as the other boats, the other Catalina 30s that have the same engine. Things are just in slightly different positions, like the water pump might be in a slightly different position and such. We can see the fuel line coming in from the back, goes to the Raycor filter, and then we have the separator where any water would flow to the bottom, and we're seeing nice pink fuel right now. This then goes to a lift pump, which I believe is not functional anymore, but is still in place. So that fuel line then comes up to a filter, and then the actual operational lift pump. Then, as on the other diesels, three-cylinder diesels, the fuel comes over to another filter, a finer filter, and then that goes off to the high pressure pump right here. Really the only thing different is there's one other older lift pump in line that's not operational. A couple things to note here. First of all, we have on the back of the engine a 20 amp breaker. It's a button breaker, so the button is on this side. My finger's on it right now. And if this breaker were to pop, you wouldn't have any power to the instruments up in the cockpit. You wouldn't be able to start the engine because this provides power to all of that. That is something to check if you don't have any power up there and you've already checked to make sure you have the Perco turned on. Why it popped is, of course, another question. But sometimes things just happen, and you can possibly salvage a cruise by just resetting that breaker. Okay. We do see a lot of wiring back here. This is where all the engine wiring then goes to the wiring harness that goes back to the instruments in the cockpit. If things were not to be working on any particular instruments like the fuel gauge or something else, you can just check for loose wires, which happens because you get a lot of vibration from these diesel engines. We're now looking at the starter battery, which is just behind the engine in a cubby hole on the starboard side. This one's actually quite easy to get to. I think you can go ahead and close that because I want to put this down. The house batteries, on the other hand, are not so easy to get to. They are all the way in the back of the aft compartment, and you can open those two panels and see those. The battery charger is actually back there also on that port side. It's actually tucked around behind that. Back in there is the battery charger. So this is the electrical panel on island side, and we have the AC 120 volt off to the aft side, the Perco battery selector, and then the DC side. Pretty self-explanatory. There is some labeling here that the water heater and the refrigerator should be left in the off position, which is out as it is now, and that the outlets and battery charger are on the in position or on. Again, we can select, it's a radio coming on, house battery, all batteries, or start battery. The one thing to remember is if you have the engine running, never switch off the Perco because it can damage the diodes in the alternator. Get a spike back when there's no load, and it can just blow them out. Anyway, so pretty self-explanatory. There's a light for the windlass. We don't have a windlass, so that's never going to light up. And then everything else, there are breakers in groups of 3. So if something were to pop, you can just push those back into reset. And you always leave the bilge pump in auto mode, although you can switch it to manual to test it. And then likewise, you can always test the batteries. I'm on the engine battery, which is reading about 12.7. And our house batteries up closer to 13 because we've got the charger on. We do have a system that's at least partially functional. It's called the Link 10 that's monitoring the batteries. And this cycles through. The voltage will come up here in a second. That's actually amp hours, which you can use to monitor how much you're pulling off a battery. And it will cycle through and say 13.1 volts, which means the battery charger's on. There it is, 13.1. And then amps, virtually none, since nothing's really on right now and the battery's pretty well charged. And that's amp hours. And that's everything. I don't know if we have a manual for this on the boat, but you could probably Google it, Link 10. So we are at the looking at the propane tank in the aft stern lazarette. It's a little tricky to get the lid off. Okay, so we can see the primary valve, which is closed right now. There is a pressure gauge, which if I open this, should read something. But that's only an indication that there's pressure in the tank, and it doesn't give you any idea about how much propane you have. then have a regulator. It goes over here to a solenoid. So there's a switch on the DC panel that turns that on. This one actually has a separate valve for possibly putting in another tank, but it's in the off position. And then this goes off to the stove. Best way to determine the amount of propane is to lift it, and you know, over time you get a calibrated arm. This one's probably more than half full. We do have scales, and we can weigh the tank, and it has a full and empty weight stenciled on the tank, and you can then determine approximately what the value is. But I use the old, yeah, almost full. Island side has a pressurized water system, and the pump for that system is behind the engine in the aft compartment on the port side, accessible through a panel. This boat actually has, like the 30s, has two water tanks, a forward tank and another midship tank on the starboard side, and that feeds the sink as well as the swim step shower. We are in the head on island side and looking under the sink, as there are quite a collection of valves, pumps of assorted. You can see a ice box outlet, head sink outlet sign down there, and without a light I can't see in there very well. Okay, so there's the to the aft side, there's the marine head inlet valve. We do have a direct discharge, this large valve which is tapped off, so you can't direct discharge. There is a macerator under here at the back upper level coming from the holding tank. What's called a marine head outlet is actually the macerator through hole, and you would want that to use that if you're 3 miles offshore or 6 miles off the island of the marine sanctuary, and then you can pump out the head. And this might be the sink outlet, yes. So that's that. There's also a separate little foot pump here. That's to pump out the ice box. We're looking at the bilge on island side, and this has a standard float switch, which is forward of a bulkhead, and the actual pump is aft of that bulkhead. So we can reach down and lift that up, and we should hear it come on, and we do, and it drains the bilge. Bilge is pretty clean. It's nice clean water, so that's a nice feature. And it turned off. So, functional system. Hope you enjoy this video, and definitely watch it before your first training. Thanks.